June 17, 1945. LaGuardia Field, New York. The DC-4 transport touched down on American soil carrying cargo more valuable than gold or uranium. 16 Soviet officers, heroes of the Soviet Union, men whose chests bore medals earned in blood across the killing fields of Eastern Europe. Major Alexei Volkov stepped onto the tarmac and felt the humid summer air of Long Island wash over him like a physical blow. Behind him, his comrades descended the aircraft stairs with the controlled movements of combat veterans, their eyes scanning instinctively for threats that didn't exist here, 3,000 miles from the smoking ruins of Berlin. What Volkov couldn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that they were about to encounter something far more disorienting than German artillery. They were entering enemy territory more dangerous than any battlefield. A society of material abundance, so overwhelming that it would shake the ideological foundations upon which their entire worldview rested. The war against fascism was over. The war for their souls was just beginning. The delegation had been carefully selected by the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs in consultation with the NKVD. Each man represented the finest of Soviet military achievement. Colonel Ivan Belov, who had commanded a tank brigade at Kursk. Captain Dmitry Sokolov, a fighter pilot with 19 German aircraft to his credit. Lieutenant Yuri Petrov, an artillery officer who had shelled Berlin itself. They had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, where 27 million Soviet citizens had perished. They had witnessed atrocities that would haunt them forever. They had liberated concentration camps and seen the depths of human evil. Nothing in that experience prepared them for suburban Connecticut. The first 48 hours passed in a carefully controlled blur. Official receptions at the Soviet embassy in Washington. Meetings with State Department officials who spoke in diplomatic platitudes. Tours of the Pentagon, where American officers showed off organizational charts and logistics systems. The Soviets nodded politely, took notes, and maintained the stoic facades expected of representatives of the world's newest superpower. But beneath the surface, small cracks were forming in their carefully constructed understanding of capitalist America. On the third day, their American escorts, a mix of State Department handlers and Army intelligence officers, drove them through New Jersey industrial suburbs en route to a factory tour. Major Volkov, sitting in the back of a Packard sedan, watched the landscape roll past with growing confusion. Where were the slums Marx had promised? Where were the exploited workers living in Dickensian squalor? Instead, he saw street after street of modest but well-maintained homes, each with its own small yard. Working-class neighborhoods, their translator explained, where factory workers lived. These houses, Volkov asked carefully in his limited English, they are for supervisors? Management. The translator smiled. No, Major. These are homes for ordinary workers. Machinists, assembly line operators, truck drivers. Volkov said nothing, but his hand tightened on his notebook. In his mind, he was comparing this to the communal apartments of Moscow, where 3 families shared a single bathroom and kitchen. He thought of the barracks where Soviet workers lived near the Urals factories, structures barely more comfortable than German POW camps. Something didn't align with what he had been taught about capitalist exploitation. The real shock came that afternoon at an A&P supermarket in Newark. The Soviet delegation had requested to see how ordinary Americans obtained food, expecting to witness the ration queues and bare shelves they knew from home. Instead, they walked into a cathedral of abundance that seemed to violate the laws of economics itself. The market stretched before them like a hallucination. Aisle after aisle of goods stacked floor to ceiling. Fresh fruit in June, oranges, bananas, grapes, displayed in colorful pyramids. Meat counters offering beef, pork, and chicken with no queue, no ration cards, no limits. Shelves of canned goods bearing labels in bright primary colors. An entire aisle devoted to breakfast cereals, at least 30 different brands competing for attention. And everywhere people, ordinary workers in casual clothes, pushing metal carts and selecting items with the casual indifference of those who had never known hunger. Captain Sokolov, the fighter pilot, stopped in front of the produce section and simply stared. His hands, which had been steady in combat at 400 miles per hour, trembled slightly as he picked up an orange. "How much?" he asked the translator. 12 cents. Sokolov did the mental calculation, converting to rubles. The orange cost approximately what a Soviet factory worker earned in 30 minutes. But the worker could simply buy it, without papers, without permission, without waiting. He set it down carefully, as if it might explode. Then they encountered the Coca-Cola display. A promotional setup near the front of the store featured a massive refrigerated case filled with glass bottles of the dark, bubbling liquid. A cardboard cutout of a smiling woman in a red dress invited shoppers to enjoy Coca-Cola, the pause that refreshes. A young stock clerk, noticing the foreign visitors, approached with the enthusiastic hospitality of someone who had never known war. "Want to try one?" he asked, pulling a bottle from the cooler. "On the house." Through the translator, the offer was extended. Major Volkov accepted, more from politeness than interest. The clerk popped the cap with a practiced motion, and carbonated mist rose from the bottle's mouth. Volkov raised it to his lips and drank. The sensation was unlike anything in his experience. Ice cold, almost painfully carbonated, intensely sweet with flavors he couldn't identify, vanilla, citrus, something indefinable that seemed to capture the essence of celebration itself. It was frivolous, unnecessary, purely hedonistic. It served no nutritional purpose except pleasure. And it was available to anyone with pocket change. "We drink this?" Volkov asked. "Just because we want." "Sure," the clerk shrugged. "It's just Coke. Everybody drinks it. Just Coke. Everybody drinks it." Those 6 words contained a philosophy of abundance that contradicted everything Volkov had learned about capitalism. Under capitalism, the people were supposed to suffer while plutocrats hoarded resources. Yet here was a luxury beverage, carbonated, flavored, refrigerated, bottled in glass, being consumed casually by workers on their lunch breaks. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical. Lieutenant Petrov, the artillery officer, took a bottle and examined it like an unexploded shell. "How is this made?" he asked. The translator laughed. "I have no idea. It's a secret formula. The Coca-Cola company doesn't tell anyone. A secret formula. A private company keeping industrial secrets not for military purposes, but to sell flavored sugar water." The concept seemed almost decadent. But Petrov couldn't deny the evidence of his senses. The bottle in his hand was real. The workers buying it were real. The entire system of casual consumption was undeniably, impossibly real. That evening, in their hotel rooms at the Waldorf Astoria, another shock of luxury that left them speechless, the Soviet officers gathered for an unofficial discussion. Their NKVD political officer, Major Konstantin Grekov, had been observing their reactions with increasing concern. "Comrades," Grekov began carefully, "we must remember why we are here. We are studying American industrial capacity, not being seduced by capitalist propaganda." "Is it propaganda if it's real?" Captain Sokolov asked quietly. The question hung in the air like artillery smoke. Grekov's face hardened. "What we have seen today is the exploitation of resources stolen from the global proletariat. American abundance is built on imperialism. Then why do their workers live better than our workers?" The question came from Colonel Belov, the tank commander. His voice was soft, but the challenge was unmistakable. The silence that followed was dangerous. In the Soviet system, such questions led to very dark places. Grekov made a note in his small leather book, and the conversation died. But in the privacy of their individual rooms, the Soviet officers lay awake, their minds churning. They had survived Stalingrad, had watched their friends die in frozen trenches, had eaten horsemeat and felt lucky to get it. They had done this believing in the superiority of the Soviet system, in the inevitable triumph of socialism over decadent capitalism. Yet the decadent capitalists apparently ate oranges in June and drank carbonated beverages for pleasure. The next phase of their education began in Los Angeles, where Hollywood's dream factories awaited. The Soviet delegation arrived in California by train, another revelation of American infrastructure. The transcontinental journey that would have taken weeks in the Soviet Union was accomplished in 3 days aboard the Super Chief, a streamlined marvel of Art Deco luxury. They ate in dining cars with white tablecloths and actual menus offering choices. They slept in private compartments with clean sheets changed daily. They watched the American landscape roll past, endless farmland showing no signs of war damage, cities with electric lights blazing wastefully into the night, highways crowded with private automobiles. Lieutenant Petrov spent hours at the observation car window, making notes. The entries in his journal grew increasingly troubled. "We are told that capitalism creates poverty," he wrote in Russian. "But if this is poverty, what have we created?" Hollywood in 1945 was operating at peak capacity, churning out films to feed a nation hungry for entertainment after years of war. The studio system was in its golden age, a factory approach to dream manufacturing that produced over 400 films annually. The Soviet delegation's tour included Warner Brothers, MGM, and Paramount, where they watched sound stages transform into alien worlds through the magic of technology and unlimited budgets. But the real impact came when they attended an actual movie screening at Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. The theater itself was an architectural hallucination, a Chinese pagoda fantasy palace that served no purpose except spectacular excess. Major Volkov stood in the forecourt, staring at the handprints of movie stars pressed into concrete, a shrine to celebrity that seemed to parody the hero worship of Soviet propaganda. Inside, the opulence escalated beyond belief. The lobby featured a 30-foot ceiling decorated with elaborate Chinese motifs. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over carpeting, so thick it absorbed sound. A concession stand, another shock, sold candy, popcorn, and yes, Coca-Cola, to patrons who seemed to regard this as normal. The auditorium seated 2,000 people in plush velvet seats arranged in curved rows that offered perfect sightlines to a screen larger than any they had ever seen. The Soviets took their seats as the lights dimmed. What followed was a cultural bombardment more devastating than any Katyusha rocket barrage. The film was Anchors Aweigh, a Technicolor musical starring Gene Kelly and Frank Sinatra. For 2 hours and 20 minutes, the Soviet officers sat in air-conditioned comfort, watching a fantasy of American naval life that bore no resemblance to actual military service. Sailors sang and danced through spotless ships. They went on shore leave in a Los Angeles where everyone was beautiful, where problems were solved through romantic comedy, where the biggest crisis was whether a cartoon mouse could help you meet a pretty girl. The technical achievement was undeniable. The Technicolor process created images of saturated brilliance that made Soviet films look primitive by comparison. The musical numbers featured choreography involving dozens of dancers in perfect synchronization. The cartoon sequence, combining live action with animation, demonstrated technical mastery that seemed almost magical. And underneath it all was a philosophy that Soviet cinema rigorously avoided: the celebration of individual desire over collective need. When the lights came up, Captain Sokolov sat motionless, processing what he had witnessed. In Soviet films, individuals sacrificed for the motherland. Heroes died gloriously for the collective. Romance was secondary to duty. But in Anchors Aweigh, personal happiness was the entire point. The sailors pursued their individual dreams, and the system rewarded them for it. Nobody was asked to sacrifice anything except their inhibitions. "It's propaganda," Major Grekov whispered, "designed to make capitalism seem desirable." "Is it propaganda?" Colonel Belov replied. "If people actually live like this?" The question was becoming a refrain, and it was becoming more dangerous each time it was asked. That night, the delegation attended a reception at the Hollywood Canteen, a club where servicemen could mingle with movie stars. The Soviet officers, wearing their dress uniforms heavy with medals, found themselves surrounded by American celebrities who treated them with genuine warmth. Rita Hayworth danced with Major Volkov. Humphrey Bogart shared drinks with Colonel Belov. Betty Davis asked Lieutenant Petrov about the siege of Leningrad and listened with tears in her eyes. But beneath the surface friendliness, Volkov sensed something more complex. These Americans were genuinely grateful for Soviet sacrifices on the Eastern Front. They understood that while America fought in Western Europe and the Pacific, the Soviets had bled the Wehrmacht white across thousands of miles of Eastern Front. 27 million dead. An entire generation decimated. Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad. Names that would echo through history as monuments to suffering. Yet this gratitude was mixed with something else. A confidence bordering on smugness. A certainty that their system, for all its flaws, had produced something special. As Volkov danced with Rita Hayworth, moving awkwardly to swing music he didn't understand, he found himself asking questions that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. What if Marx was wrong? What if capitalism, at least in its American form, actually worked better than socialism? What if the Soviet people had sacrificed everything for a system that couldn't match American abundance? The thoughts were treasonous. They were also becoming impossible to suppress. The delegation's final week was spent in a carefully orchestrated tour of American industrial might. They visited Ford's River Rouge plant in Detroit, where assembly lines produced a complete automobile every 60 seconds. They toured Pittsburgh steel mills that dwarfed anything in the Soviet Union. They inspected aircraft factories where B-29 superfortresses took shape with precision that seemed almost supernatural. But the real education happened in the margins, during unscheduled moments when their handlers weren't watching. At a diner in Detroit, Lieutenant Petrov struck up a conversation with a factory worker on his lunch break. Through the translator, they discussed working conditions, pay, and life in America. The worker, a Ukrainian immigrant named Stepan who had left the Russian Empire in 1910, spoke in a mix of broken Russian and English. "In old country," Stepan explained, "I was serf's grandson. Nothing. Here, I have house. I have automobile, Ford, from factory where I work. My children go to university. My wife has washing machine, electric stove. We are not rich. But we are not hungry. Nobody tells us what to do." Petrov pressed further. "But the factory owner, he exploits you?" Stepan laughed. "He pays me $42 each week. I pay rent, buy food, save money. Exploitation? Maybe. But I eat meat 3 times per week. My parents in Ukraine ate meat 3 times per year." The mathematics of that comparison was devastating. Petrov had grown up on a collective farm where meat was rare enough to be memorable. Yet this factory worker, this supposedly exploited proletarian, ate better than Soviet party officials. The conversations multiplied as the delegation's guard began to slip. In New York, Colonel Belov met a labor union organizer who described collective bargaining, strikes, and workplace democracy within the capitalist framework. In Chicago, Captain Sokolov talked to a journalist who criticized the American government in print without fear of arrest. In San Francisco, Major Volkov encountered Jewish refugees from Europe who explained why they chose America over Palestine or the Soviet Union. Each conversation added another crack to the ideological foundation. The American system wasn't perfect. They saw poverty in Harlem, discrimination against Negroes, labor strife, and political corruption. But they also saw a working class with automobiles, a free press that published criticism, and a government that changed peacefully through elections. The system was messy, inefficient, wasteful, and undeniably functional. The final blow came during a casual visit to a typical American suburban home in White Plains, New York. The family, a machinist named Robert Miller, his wife Helen, and their 2 children, had volunteered to host the Soviet officers for dinner. The State Department had carefully vetted them to ensure appropriate political reliability, but nobody had prepared the Soviets for the casual display of middle-class American life. The Miller house was a 2-story colonial-style structure with 3 bedrooms, a living room, dining room, kitchen, and 2 bathrooms. It had a small front lawn, a backyard with a vegetable garden, and a garage containing a 1941 Chevrolet. The interior featured furniture that wasn't fancy, but was comfortable and well-maintained. There was a radio in the living room, a telephone in the hallway, and electric lighting throughout. The kitchen contained a refrigerator, an electric stove, and a washing machine. Robert Miller worked at a nearby factory making airplane parts. He earned $53 per week. He owned his house through a mortgage, a concept that had to be explained to the Soviets. A bank had loaned him money to buy the property, which he was paying back over 20 years. When the mortgage was paid, he would own the house outright. The idea that a worker could own property was difficult to process. Over dinner, roast chicken with potatoes, vegetables from their garden, and apple pie for dessert, the Millers talked about their lives with the unself-conscious ease of people who had nothing to hide. Robert described his work, his union membership, his hopes that his children would go to college. Helen talked about volunteering at the school, her part-time work at a local shop, her plans to buy a new washing machine next year. The children, aged 8 and 10, talked about school, friends, and their anticipation of going to the movies that weekend. It was crushingly, devastatingly normal. Major Volkov excused himself to use the bathroom and found himself standing in a private indoor bathroom with hot running water, a flush toilet, and a medicine cabinet full of products he couldn't identify. This family, this ordinary working-class family, lived better than most Soviet officials. They had more space, more comfort, more choice. And they seemed to think this was unremarkable. Walking back to the dining room, Volkov passed through the children's bedroom. 2 beds, a shared desk, shelves of books, toys scattered on the floor. On the wall was a pennant from the New York Yankees and a poster of Superman. The children were learning to dream about individual achievement, hitting home runs, saving the world, not collective sacrifice for the motherland. At the end of the evening, as they prepared to leave, Robert Miller shook hands with each Soviet officer. "We're grateful for what you guys did," he said through the translator. "Taking on Hitler the way you did. We know it cost you." "Yes," Major Volkov replied. "It cost us everything." The double meaning of those words hit him as he spoke them. The Soviet Union had sacrificed 27 million people to defeat fascism. But what had they won? A system that couldn't feed its people, as well as American capitalism fed its workers. A society where indoor plumbing was a privilege, not a right. An ideology that promised paradise but delivered perpetual shortage. The return journey to the Soviet Union began on July 8, 1945. The delegation boarded an Army Air Forces transport at LaGuardia for the long flight back to Moscow, this time via Alaska and Siberia. As New York City disappeared beneath the clouds, the Soviet officers sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Major Grekov, the NKVD political officer, had been taking notes throughout the journey. His report would be extensive and damning. He had observed ideological contamination among several officers, noted dangerous questions, identified individuals whose loyalty had become suspect. In the Soviet system, such observations could be death sentences. But even Grekov was troubled. In his private journal, kept in a code he had developed himself, he had written observations that would have horrified his superiors. "The American system is more resilient than we believed," one entry noted. "Their abundance is not propaganda. It is real. How do we compete with this?" The question would haunt the Soviet Union for the next 46 years until the system finally collapsed under its own contradictions. But in July 1945, that collapse seemed impossible. The Red Army was the most powerful military force on Earth. Soviet prestige was at its peak. Victory over fascism seemed to validate the socialist system. Yet 16 Soviet officers had seen something that couldn't be unseen. Capitalism worked. The landing in Moscow brought them back to a reality that seemed even grimmer after their American sojourn. The airfield was cratered from German bombing, only partially repaired. The city they drove through showed the scars of war, buildings damaged, streets torn up, people thin and worn from years of privation. Stalin's propaganda posters promised a glorious socialist future, but the present looked desperately bleak. The delegation was immediately sequestered for debriefing. For 3 weeks, they were questioned intensively about everything they had seen, everyone they had talked to, every thought they had entertained. NKVD interrogators probed for signs of ideological weakness, for contamination by capitalist ideas, for any hint of disloyalty. Most of the officers understood the game. They praised Soviet achievements, criticized American inequality and racism, expressed gratitude for the opportunity to study the enemy. They filed reports emphasizing American military-industrial capacity while downplaying the living standards they had witnessed. They survived the debriefing and returned to their military careers. But some couldn't maintain the fiction. Lieutenant Yuri Petrov, the artillery officer who had shelled Berlin, made the mistake of honesty. During his debriefing, when asked to compare Soviet and American living standards, he replied that American workers lived better than Soviet workers. He provided specific examples: the supermarket abundance, the private homes, the casual consumption of luxury goods like Coca-Cola. His interrogator made careful notes. 3 weeks later, Petrov was arrested on charges of anti-Soviet agitation. The evidence included his journal entries from America, which had been confiscated and analyzed. Passages about American prosperity were interpreted as criticism of the Soviet system. His questions about socialist efficiency were deemed ideologically subversive. Petrov was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag system. He served 8 years in a logging camp in Kolyma, the coldest inhabited region on Earth, where temperatures reached -60 degrees Fahrenheit. He survived barely and was released in 1953 after Stalin's death. But he never spoke publicly about his American journey again. The price of honesty had been too high. Captain Dmitry Sokolov, the fighter pilot, handled his disillusionment differently. He maintained perfect political orthodoxy in public while struggling with private doubt. He continued his military career, eventually commanding a fighter regiment during the Cold War. But those who knew him well noticed changes. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He drank heavily, a common Soviet coping mechanism. In 1967, during a rare moment of candor with a trusted friend, Sokolov finally spoke about America. "We won the war," he said. "We defeated Hitler. 27 million of us died for that victory. But the Americans won the peace. They won it with supermarkets and movie theaters and Coca-Cola. They won it by making capitalism comfortable. We can't compete with that. We never could. 6 months later, Sokolov died of liver failure, officially attributed to his war wounds, but really caused by decades of vodka-medicated despair. Colonel Ivan Belov, the tank commander, took the most pragmatic approach. He recognized that the Soviet system had fundamental flaws, but also understood that openly acknowledging those flaws was suicidal. He continued his career, rose to general rank, and became a respected military theorist. But in his classified writings about future warfare, he consistently emphasized Soviet industrial weakness compared to American capacity. His arguments for military modernization were implicitly arguments for systemic reform. During the Khrushchev thaw of the 1950s, when brief liberalization allowed limited criticism, Belov wrote a carefully worded memo suggesting that Soviet consumer goods production needed dramatic improvement to maintain public morale. The memo referenced his 1945 American observations, noting that capitalist abundance posed an ideological threat more dangerous than military force. The memo was filed, ignored, and eventually forgotten, but Belov had planted a seed. The idea that the Soviet Union needed to compete with American living standards, not just military might, would eventually become mainstream during Gorbachev's perestroika. By then, it was too late. Major Alexei Volkov, the delegation leader, perhaps suffered the most complex fate. He rose to the rank of lieutenant general, commanded Soviet forces in Eastern Europe, and became a trusted member of the military establishment. Publicly, he was a perfect Soviet officer, loyal to the party and the system. Privately, he was a man haunted by what he had seen. Volkov's personal papers, discovered after his death in 1983, revealed the depth of his internal conflict. In a letter never sent to his wife, written in 1960, he reflected on the American journey. We were told that capitalism enslaves workers while socialism liberates them. In America, I saw workers with automobiles, homes, and choices. In the Soviet Union, I see workers with nothing but promises of a future that never arrives. I fought for this system. I killed for it. My friends died for it. But I cannot escape the question, were we wrong? The question was never answered. Volkov died without seeing the Soviet collapse, but his doubts were vindicated. The system he had defended couldn't compete with the abundance he had witnessed in America. The war of ideologies wasn't won on battlefields. It was won in supermarkets, movie theaters, and suburban living rooms. The impact of the 1945 Soviet delegation's visit rippled through history in ways both obvious and subtle. In the immediate post-war period, Soviet authorities became more aggressive about restricting foreign contact. The experiment of exposing Soviet officers to American life had revealed a dangerous truth. Seeing capitalist abundance could undermine socialist conviction. Future delegations were more carefully controlled, their movements restricted, their observations filtered through political officers. But information has a way of spreading. The Soviet officers who visited America talked to friends, family, and colleagues. Stories of American supermarkets, of Coca-Cola and movie palaces, spread through whispered conversations. The more the Soviet government insisted that capitalism meant misery, the more these counter-narratives gained credibility. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality became harder to ignore. The 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow, where Vice President Nixon and Premier Khrushchev engaged in their famous kitchen debate, was a direct descendant of this realization. The Soviets understood that they needed to demonstrate comparable living standards to maintain ideological legitimacy. The exhibition's display of American consumer goods, washing machines, televisions, modern kitchens, drew massive crowds of Soviets hungry to see what the capitalist enemy had produced. Khrushchev's response, arguing that Soviet citizens didn't need such luxuries, that socialist housing was superior, that material comfort wasn't the measure of a good society, rang increasingly hollow. The Soviet people had heard the stories. They knew that American workers lived well. The propaganda couldn't overcome the evidence. By the 1970s and 1980s, as Soviet economic stagnation became undeniable, the memory of American abundance haunted Soviet leadership. Brezhnev's gerontocracy presided over a system that could produce nuclear weapons and space stations, but couldn't provide its people with toilet paper or fresh vegetables. The contrast with American consumer society became impossible to ignore. When Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika in the mid-1980s, he was essentially admitting what those Soviet officers had realized in 1945. The Soviet system couldn't compete with capitalist productivity. His reforms were an attempt to introduce market mechanisms while maintaining socialist ideology, to have Coca-Cola without capitalism. The effort failed, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The 16 Soviet officers who visited America in the summer of 1945 had witnessed the future. They had seen a system that, despite its flaws and contradictions, produced abundance that socialism couldn't match. Some tried to warn their government. Some tried to forget what they had seen. All of them understood, at some level, that they had encountered a truth that would eventually destroy the system they had fought to defend. The real shock wasn't the Coca-Cola or the movie theaters. It was the realization that capitalism, at least in its American form, had solved the problem of material scarcity more effectively than revolutionary socialism. Marx had promised that communism would create abundance by eliminating capitalist exploitation. Instead, American capitalism had created abundance through industrial efficiency, mass production, and market competition. The Soviet officers who had survived Stalingrad and conquered Berlin couldn't survive the cognitive dissonance of that realization. Some, like Petrov, were destroyed by the state for admitting the truth. Others, like Sokolov, destroyed themselves trying to suppress it. A few, like Volkov, lived with the contradiction, performing loyalty while harboring doubt. Their tragedy was understanding too much too soon. They had seen the end of the story in 1945, but they had to live through 46 more years of a system they knew was failing. They were veterans of a war that had already been lost, even as the Soviet Union celebrated its victory over fascism. The bottles of Coca-Cola they had tasted in that Newark supermarket were more dangerous than any German weapon. The movie they had watched in Hollywood's Chinese theater was more subversive than any capitalist propaganda. The suburban home where they had eaten dinner was more revolutionary than any Marxist manifesto. These ordinary symbols of American life represented something the Soviet system could never match. The casual abundance that comes from productive efficiency rather than revolutionary redistribution. They represented a different answer to humanity's ancient struggle with scarcity, an answer that didn't require sacrifice, collective discipline, or revolutionary consciousness. Just refrigeration, mass production, and market competition. Just Coca-Cola, movie theaters, and suburban homes. Just capitalism working exactly as it was designed to work. The Soviet soldiers who witnessed this in 1945 understood something their leaders couldn't admit. They had won the war, but were losing the peace. The future belonged not to the nation with the strongest ideology, but to the nation with the fullest supermarkets. The Cold War would be fought with missiles and spies, with proxy wars and nuclear standoffs. But it would be won with washing machines and air conditioning, with color television and fast food. 50 years after that first Soviet delegation visited America, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The hammer and sickle came down from the Kremlin, replaced by the Russian tricolor. McDonald's opened in Moscow, serving Big Macs to crowds of Russians who waited hours in line. Coca-Cola became available throughout the former Soviet Union, no longer a symbol of capitalist decadence, but simply a soft drink. The soldiers who had first tasted Coca-Cola in 1945 were mostly dead by then, their stories lost to history's footnotes. But their experience had predicted everything. They had understood, in that Newark supermarket, that material abundance was a more powerful weapon than any tank or bomber. They had realized, in that Hollywood theater, that dreams manufactured by capitalism were more seductive than dreams promised by socialism. They had won the great patriotic war against fascism. They had saved the world from Nazi tyranny. But they had lost the long twilight struggle against the soft power of American prosperity. The victory over Hitler was absolute. The defeat by Coca-Cola was inevitable. That was the real shock, the truth that some of them understood immediately and others realized over decades of slow disillusionment. The Soviet system they had fought for, that they had sacrificed everything to defend, couldn't compete with the casual abundance of American capitalism. The future didn't belong to the nation with the best ideology. It belonged to the nation with the best supermarkets. And in 1945, standing in that Newark A&P with a bottle of Coca-Cola in his hand, Major Alexei Volkov had already known how the story would end.